All right, so like Tim mentioned, I'm Alicia Ward. I'm talking to you from the International Crane Foundation. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. I work at the Crane Foundation as a Crane Conservation Fellow, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation, a species spotlight on the whooping cranes. Sorry, I don't know why my slides aren't. There we go. So many of you are probably already familiar with the International Crane Foundation, but if you're not, we're a nonprofit based in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And this is our mission statement right here. We work worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. So we're dedicated to protecting cranes in all places where they live and thrive. And more specifically, my role at the International Crane Foundation, as a Crane Conservation Fellow, I work in the North America program. So I work on our wild cranes here in Wisconsin. So that's the sandhill and the whooping crane. So I don't work as much with the cranes on exhibit. So if you have any questions on that, I can direct you to somebody who does that sort of work. The International Crane Foundation, headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin, is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. We acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying local voice and perspective in all places where crane stands. And with that introduction, I'm going to show you this slide right here. This is all 15 species of cranes that can be found throughout the world. And the International Crane Foundation exhibit areas are the only place where you can see all 15 species together. So some common features that all cranes share, they have that really long characteristic neck and long legs, giving them a tall body. They have a small head relative to their body size and a long beak. And you can see there's some variation in that, but those are the general characteristics that they all share. Here's a map depicting where these cranes live and also where they migrate. You can see these arrows here. So they really cross a lot of physical and political boundaries. There's only 2 continents where you can't find cranes, and that would be South America and Antarctica. But of course, with the time we have here today, we're going to have to focus a bit closer to home. And that brings us to these 2 cranes. So these are the birds, the crane species that you can find here in North America. The sandhill crane, which many of you are probably very familiar with, and you may have even seen one today. And then of course, there's the elusive whooping crane, which is much less common on the landscape, and it's actually the rarest species of crane. So in fact, there's actually 10 of the 15 species of crane that are threatened or endangered. So the whooping crane is not alone in that, unfortunately. And part of this is because all cranes are wetland dependent species, and wetlands are one of the most threatened habitats worldwide. So it stands to reason that these cranes are going to be affected by that. But despite their threatened or endangered status, they continue to carry a lot of cultural significance for people all over the world. And there's a few reasons for that. But one of the greatest reasons is just because they're a bird that's really easy to relate to. They dance, which they'll do to celebrate, they'll do it for exercise, and they'll do it to strengthen their pair bonds. And those pair bonds, they're monogamous. Cranes will mate for life. And they form really close social bonds, especially with their chicks. They're really great parents. They raise that chick for the entire year until they're ready to have another. They typically only have 1 chick a year, and they defend that chick very fiercely. They also have a sort of natural charisma. They're a very tall bird that's very prominent on the landscape. And they're often referred to as a living dinosaur. They're a very ancient species. There's crane fossils, sandhill crane fossils dating back to 2.5 million years ago that show they were existing in the same form back then. So this sort of ancient quality really invokes strong feelings to protect these birds that have been here for so much longer than we have. Here's some examples of cranes and cultures throughout the world. So this first photo here on the upper left depicts broga cranes and Aboriginal art out of Australia. The crane on its right is a white-naped crane, and these cranes actually winter in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. So they act as an international symbol of peace. The African black and gray crown cranes are both featured in Ugandan folklore. And then on the lower left, this is a photo depicting a celebration out of Bhutan, celebrating the black-necked crane as a symbol for agricultural prosperity. In Japanese culture, origami cranes signify a wish granted. And if you fold 1,000 cranes, it's said that you'll have a large wish granted. Then finally, a bit closer to home, these bones you see here on the lower right, they're whooping crane bones that were found in the graves of indigenous people of the Karankawa tribe in Galveston, Texas. And it's thought that these whooping crane bones were carved into whistles, perhaps to mimic some of the noises that whooping cranes make and that these indigenous people would have been hearing out in nature. So now let's move on to talking about those whooping cranes. They're an endangered bird that was actually once extirpated from Wisconsin altogether. Here we have a photo of a whooping crane wading through a wetland. While all cranes are wetland dependent species, whooping cranes are especially so. There are a few tools that you can use to help identify whooping cranes, but they are a bit of an elusive bird, so sometimes you'll hear them before you actually see them. And they get their name, the whooping crane, after their whoop-like call, which is a result of a curved trachea that's housed in their chest cavity. So if you think of like a French horn, it has all those like curves and it makes a really loud, like bellowing noise. And you get kind of the same result with the whooping crane. So we're gonna listen to two calls here. The first is a guard call, and that's used to defend territory or in threatening social situations. So I'll play that now. And Tim, if you could just let me know, did you hear that okay?
I did not hear it. I'm not sure if when you shared, did you do access to?
Yeah, let me stop sharing quick because I want to be able to have you all hear that. There we are, computer audio. Are you able to hear that at all?
I did not hear it.
Do you know where I can go to fix that?
I mean, usually when you share this is the only thing I know. Usually when you hit share screen, there's a little box you have to click if you're going to share audio. I think that's the if it's beyond that, I don't. Anybody else that knows more can chime in here. But like when you share screen, there's two boxes on the bottom, and one of them is.
Oh, there we are. Got it. All right. Sorry about that. I think, and you guys can see my screen here, right?
I can see, yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay, great. Should be working now, so let's go back. All right.
That was good. And if you could just mention to our IT person that I helped fix this problem, his name is James Shed, I would appreciate that.
Okay. All right, well, you just heard the guard call. So I'll play it one more time just in case. It always gets me because it plays twice there, but you can hear it's kind of that two-toned. To me, it sounds more like a trumpet, less of a whoop, but it's a very distinctive call and it's very loud, especially when you're in an open wetland. And then the second call we'll listen to is a unison call, and that's a call made by a bonded pair, more often during breeding season. So in a unison call, the male will start the call by raising his head up and flicking his head back. He'll drop his wings low. And then the female responds by holding her head out from her body at about a 45-degree angle, and she keeps her wings tucked in closely to her body. So try to listen here. There's two calls, and they overlap a bit. So that's the sound of a unison call. And again, they'll use that for a few reasons. They'll use it to defend their territory. They'll also use it to celebrate if they've successfully defended their territory. And whooping cranes are sexually monomorphic, meaning that there's no physical characteristics that you can use to correctly sex them. But by looking at these behavioral traits, so like the unison call, you're actually able to determine their sex with about 90% accuracy when compared to blood test. And then if you are lucky to actually see a whooping crane, there are a few traits that you can use to identify it. So first thing that you'll notice is that characteristic crane body, very tall, long neck, and long legs. They're actually the tallest bird in North America, standing at about 5 feet tall with a 7 to 8 foot wingspan. And then looking at their bodies, there's some distinct colorations which you can use to help ID these birds. So bright white body is one of the most noticeable things about them. They also have long black legs. And then looking at that face, you see they have a featherless red patch on the crown of their head, bright yellow eyes, which you probably won't be able to see unless you have very nice binoculars, and then a black mask, which is also called a mustache, stretching down below their eyes. And if we zoom in here, looking at that skin on the top of their head, it's a pretty common misconception that this is a colorful patch of feathers, but it's actually the skin with a sort of warty texture. And something interesting is that when cranes are upset, they can actually expand this area. So kind of like we might raise our eyebrows, they can pull the skin back and make it look brighter red. So you can see this crane on the left, that red patch goes much further down on the back of its head when compared to this one on the right. And this is basically just a universal sign of like, stop what you're doing, give me my space, I'm not happy with you. So on our tours here at ICF, we actually ask visitors to remove any red hats because we also want to avoid sending those cranes any mixed signals. Another interesting physiological trait is these really long legs of theirs. So if we take a closer look, you can see they have 3 very long forward-facing toes and 1 very small toe in the back known as the hallux. And because this toe is so small in the back, cranes are not able to perch or nest in trees like other bird species. And another common misconception that we hear a lot is that cranes have backwards facing knees, but this joint that you see here is actually the ankle. So a crane walks on its toes, its ankles kind of midway in their leg, and then its knee is housed more in its body, covered by skin and feathers, so it's less visible when we're just looking at them. Here we have a picture of a whooping crane in flight. Again, some key characteristics to help you ID these birds. They fly with a long outstretched neck and their long legs trail behind their tail. And although you can't see it when they're standing or relaxing, they actually have black wingtips, which are very obvious in flight, contrasting against their white body. Here's some birds that are commonly mistaken for whooping cranes in flight. There's the American white pelican. You can see it as black wingtips, but it's missing that long neck and long legs. Same with the snow goose, it's lacking those long legs. The great egret, although its shape looks a little more crane-like, it still has a short neck and it lacks black wingtips. And then the great blue heron, again, flying with a short neck. But perhaps the bird that's most commonly mistaken for a whooping crane is the sandhill crane. So you can see in this photo here, there are clear color differences between them. The sandhill crane is more brown or gray, occasionally red. And it might look easy in this photo, but you can imagine in low lighting conditions or flying overhead, it can be difficult to tell these two apart. So now that we have some background on the biology and anatomy of these whooping cranes, we're going to talk about their conservation story, which is one of perseverance, cooperation, and creativity. And this is a story that's still being played out on the landscape today. And it's still something that's a part of my work and a lot of other people's work here at the Crane Foundation. So here's the historical range map of the whooping crane. This is pre-European expansion, and it's thought that there were over 10,000 whooping cranes in North America, using wetlands and prairies all over the continent. You can see their historic range here in green. It reached all the way down to Mexico, up into the Arctic regions. And today, this historic population is represented in gray. It's known as the Aransas wood buffalo population. And you can see how much that range has shrunk. In fact, in the 1940s, this historic population got down to only about 20 whooping cranes that were left in the wild. So what caused this dramatic decline? There were many various factors, but these are the main reasons. And all this was associated with European settlement of the continent. So when Europeans moved out west, they found areas that were very lush with resources. And this was during a time where game laws were mostly ignored and rarely enforced. So this unregulated hunting and destruction of wild areas was actually responsible for the extinction of many species, including the passenger pigeon, which you might be familiar with, and the whooping cranes may have very well met the same fate if it weren't for intervention. Another factor that contributed to this decline was the egg collecting craze of the time. So whether this was for sustenance or also just as like a display, as a pride thing, eggs were collected directly off of nests. And like I said before, cranes only raise one chick a year. They'll typically only lay 1 to 2 eggs. And even once those chicks are hatched, they take 3 to 5 years to reach sexual maturity and reproduce. So by collecting eggs, you're really cutting off this population at the source, and it's very detrimental to a long-lived species like the crane. Then, of course, as unregulated hunting and egg collecting continued, the whooping crane became more and more rare, which just increased its value. Another factor that led to the decline of the whooping crane was the millinery trade, which was the trade of bird feathers to adorn women's hats. Very colorful bird species. So the Carolina parakeet, which was driven to extinction, were targets for this trade. And species like the whooping crane with large white feathers, like you can see in this photo here, were also very coveted. And it actually wasn't until some high society woman in Boston noticed the decline of many common species that they created the first Audubon Society in Massachusetts and eventually put a stop to this trade. Then finally, a threat that cranes and many other species still face today is habitat loss. So the Homestead Act of the 1860s encouraged people to move out west very rapidly. And in that process, a lot of wetlands were drained and a lot of prairies were converted to be used for agricultural fields, which took away a really valuable resource for our whooping cranes. Of course, early conservationists began to notice this decline, and we're very grateful they did. And a series of laws were put into place eventually to protect these birds and many others. So there's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which prohibits the take and trade of birds or any of their parts, including eggs. And then, of course, there's the Endangered Species Act of 1973. When this act was passed, there were only 70 whooping cranes left in the wild, and they were listed as endangered as they are today. So that brings us to our current populations. We have 4 wild populations, and in addition, we have our cranes kept in captivity. So you can see here our historic population, the central flyway here, they winter down in the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge on the coast of Texas, and then they breed up in Wood Buffalo National Park. So this is all that remains of that historic population at 543 individuals, but it's still much larger than our reintroduced populations. So we have 2 non-migratory populations. There's the Louisiana non-migratory population at 77 individuals, and then the Florida non-migratory population at only 6. We did eventually stop reintroducing birds into the Florida non-migratory population, just because it became clear that there were too many predators there that the cranes were not equipped to deal with. The cost of reintroducing a single whooping crane is about $100,000. So we really want to make sure that we're choosing the best places for these birds. But those 6 individuals in Florida are still taken care of, and we're letting them live out the rest of their lives in peace. And then the Louisiana non-migratory population, people usually ask us what the point is of having a non-migratory population. It's really a conservation strategy. So if you think about not wanting to put all your eggs in one basket, if something were to happen to our eastern flyway, or if there were a natural disaster event, we would want to have individuals in a different population that could supplement our population or the historical one. So it really acts as like a safe hold down on the coast of Louisiana. And then finally, in our eastern migratory population, the population that breeds in Wisconsin and winters further south, we have 76 individuals, and we are continuing to grow that population every year. So what all goes into a whooping crane reintroduction? It starts by the work of our very dedicated aviculturists here at the Crane Foundation. So they find cranes that have valuable genetics through various means of genetic testing. And when I say valuable genetics, I essentially just mean the birds that are most likely to increase the genetic diversity in the population. So if you think about it, a population that got down to 20 individuals, it's going to go through a great bottleneck. So genetic conservation becomes really important. After those individuals are bred by artificial insemination, we hope that they lay fertile eggs. And once they do, we will incubate those eggs until they hatch, which brings us to the rearing portion of the reintroduction. Our chicks are either parent reared, meaning that a crane foster parent will take them in, or they're costume reared like you see here. And the reason that we costume rear birds is because we don't always have enough foster parents to raise the amount of chicks that we need to reintroduce into the wild to help grow that population. So our biologists, they'll put on these costumes and they'll play crane sounds, they'll mimic crane behavior. So that way the chick doesn't imprint on humans. And basically we teach the chick everything it needs to know before eventually it is released. So these chicks that are costume or parent reared in captivity are then released into the wild in the fall. And this release method you see here with the fence is known as a soft release. Basically the crane's put into the wild and that fence is put up, but then after it's been monitored for a bit, the fence is taken down and it's free to roam. We release these birds near other adult whooping cranes so that they can follow those adults on their migration path down south. The types of habitats that whooping cranes use today, it's primarily wetlands, although in the eastern migratory population, you will occasionally see them in farm fields. So this photo here on the left shows, or the right, my apologies, shows a whooping crane foraging with some sandhills in a farm field. And when they're out there, they're mostly eating waste grains, small rodents, and insects. And the main reason that they're using these farm fields is because it's the predominant landscape in a lot of the Midwest. So if you think about it, historically, they would have been using prairies, but those prairies have become farm fields. Of course, all whooping cranes still rely on wetlands for overnight roosting and nesting. And the reason that they sleep here overnight and nest in wetlands is because it's a lot harder for a predator to sneak up on a crane sleeping in a wetland. If you've ever walked out in a wetland, it's very mucky and it's usually pretty hard to get through without making some splashing noises unless you have these very delicate long legs. So by sleeping out there, it just provides an extra layer of protection. They also still forage in wetlands. They provide a lot more nutritious foods, so fish, berries, and tubers. If you think about like eating corn all day in a field, it's the equivalent of eating potato chips all day. You need to get your nutrients somehow. So that's why cranes return to the wetlands. And they use these wetlands through all seasons of their annual cycle, which we're going to talk through now. And I'm going to turn the laser pointer on really quick so I can help point this out. We're going to start with the breeding season, which is represented by this middle lighter blue color. And I'll start here in March. This outer ring shows when eggs begin to be laid. So you can see in April, egg production peaks. And then of course, from eggs, we get our young cranes, which will be raised and travel with their parents all throughout these seasons, even into the spring migration until those parents are ready to breed again. So over here, this is the beginning of our fall migration. You can see it starts in late September and it peaks October through November. And then cranes will winter in January and February. These are the times in Wisconsin that are the coldest. So there's not as many resources here available to them. Their wetlands are frozen. There's not as much food. So they move further south in search of better resources. And then finally, when things begin to thaw, they'll come back for spring migration, which peaks in March and kind of peters off into April. All right, so now with that, I'm going to talk through each of these phases, beginning with breeding season. So again, breeding will start with nesting, March through June. Here in Wisconsin, whooping cranes establish a territory and they'll defend that territory with their mate. And they'll do that before they start nesting. So it's territory and then nest. In Wisconsin, our whooping cranes nest in two main wetlands, and that is at the Necedah National Wildlife Refuge and the Horicon National Wildlife Refuge. These are where the birds in this population were originally released. And if you've been to either of these sites, you know that they're very large and they definitely have enough space available for our whooping cranes to all safely establish and defend their territories, while also providing a safe home for their chicks. So I'm going to play this video really quick. This is taken at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, and it's a video of a whooping crane defending its territory from a couple sandhills. We'll only watch the first minute or so. And I'll explain some interesting behaviors as I see them. So here, both the sandhill on the left and the whooping crane on the right are displaying. The sandhill crane takes a very offensive attack, throwing out its talons at the whooping crane. The whooping crane's kind of sneaking up on the sandhills, doing a parade walk, and that's where they kind of stomp around very threateningly. Looks like the sandhill cranes are doing a bit of a unison call there. You can see when the cranes go to strike, they put their wings out, essentially just showing off their body size. And finally, that right there where he put his head back, that I think was a bit of threat preening. So whooping cranes and other crane species, they'll threat preen and they'll also threat forage. So just normal behaviors that they'll do threateningly. And it seems to be working on these sandhills here, who seem to be a bit frazzled. All right. So once they have their territory established, they're ready to start nesting. They'll build their nest in wetlands like this on these large platforms. And in that nest, they'll lay 1 to 2 eggs, which they'll incubate for about 30 days. From those 2 eggs, they typically only hatch 1 colt. Sometimes they'll hatch 2. And you might hear me use the terms colt and chick interchangeably. They mean the same thing. So sometimes they'll raise 2 colts, but it is very energetically expensive for the parents to do so. And you'll notice that these eggs and the colt are this buffy brown color. And that's thought to be camouflage, essentially because an egg and a chick can't fly away from predators as well as the parents can. So staying in those wetlands, on those nests, and blending into the environment is the best shot that they have at survival until they eventually fledge. So these parents, they raise their colts June through October, and it takes about 80 days for that bird to fledge. So fledging means that they have all their flight feathers grown in and that their muscles are strong enough to sustain flight. It takes about 3 months for these chicks to be as tall as their parents, like you can see in this photo here. But they'll keep that cinnamon plumage for about a full year before they completely look all white like their parents. And again, they take 3 to 5 years to reach full sexual maturity. So even once they look like their parents, they will stay in bachelor groups for a while before they establish their own territory. So once those chicks are grown, it's time to bring them along on fall migration. So you can see this photo here on the right. It shows a juvenile whooping crane flying with an adult whooping crane. You can see that a lot of its white has come in, but it still has that cinnamon color on its head and on the backs of its wings. Unlike sandhill cranes, which form these really large flocks before fall migration, Whooping cranes are typically only seen in groups of 1 to 4, and that's usually their family units. They just don't flock the same way sandhills do, but they will occasionally stage with sandhills, like you can see this photo here on the left. So staging is a period before migration where all the birds will gather together and they'll basically just eat as much as they can. And the reason they do this all together is because there's power in numbers. So if a predator sneaks up on them, there's lots of individuals there ready to alert everybody else that there's a predator. So it just allows for some safer environments to basically forage all day in preparation for a very long fall migration. During that migration, they will run into a few challenges. And this is the same for spring migration. There's always the challenge of poor weather. So storms, rain, snowstorms, high winds. Typically, whooping cranes, they will roost in wetlands and wait these periods of bad weather out. There's also the threat of impact trauma. So that can be caused by cars, and it can also be caused by power lines, like the ones you see here. One of the things we do at the Crane Foundation to reduce this risk is we work with electric companies to put up these flight diverters. And basically what these do is they flap around in the wind and they help our whooping cranes see the lines and fly over them. You can imagine that if you've been migrating all day, you start to get tired. Our whooping cranes fly lower, they're usually less vigilant, which also leads to increased predation. So when these cranes are very tired, they're not going to be as alert of predators. And then, of course, there is the continued threat of habitat loss. So although whooping cranes are flying all day, they still roost in wetlands overnight throughout their migration. And wetlands are consistently being challenged by urban expansion and the conversion for agricultural use. So we try to mitigate all of these challenges whenever possible, but hopefully all of our cranes will make it safely to their wintering grounds. So between November and March, when they move into spring migration, they'll spend time at these wintering grounds. You can see this map here on the right. They really don't go too far south. Most of the cranes go to western Indiana or eastern Illinois. You can see here in the Jasper, Pulaski, and Goose Pond regions. And then a lot of them also aggregate in the Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alabama. And I know it just looks like a small dot there, but a lot of dots are stacked on top of each other. That is where the majority of our whooping cranes will winter. So they'll stay in these wintering zones and they'll forage in wetlands and they'll use agricultural fields just like they do during breeding season until they get those weather cues and they get cues from the daylight hours and they know it's time to start heading back out north for spring migration. Just like in fall migration, whooping cranes will join these large flocks of sandhills to travel. And this actually leads to one of the most impressive sights. Hopefully some of you have had the chance to see this, but when sandhills fly in after migration to roost, they fly in huge flocks. And one of the most impressive displays can be seen at the Platte River in Nebraska. So here you can see over 600,000 sandhill cranes flying to roost. And in that group, there's usually about 500 whooping cranes. But I'd like to point out that those 500, they're from the historic population. They are not our eastern whooping cranes. But nonetheless, it's very exciting. And I will play this video quickly just to show the magnitude of that migration. You can see from that photo there, it's really an impressive sight. I've heard it's incredibly loud, but it's something that I hope all of you get a chance to see, and I'd really like to see myself one day. So in their spring migration and also in their fall migration, whooping cranes use thermal vents, which are basically these warm updrafts of air. So cooler descends and then the warm air that gets heated by the surface, rises up in these large columns. So this is why you often see birds flying in circles. They're following those thermal vents. And the reason they do this is just to conserve energy. So you'll see in this video here, when a crane or any bird is flying on a thermal vent, it really doesn't have to flap its wings, and it gives it some altitude that allows it to glide further. So you can see there's almost no flapping going on in that shot.
Look at hardly anybody.
These are sandhips. And there they are circling around.
Takes us 4 hours to get there in the video.
All right, so it takes a lot to migrate. As you can see, there's a lot of challenges that are met along the way. Here we have a detailed graph of the eastern migratory population throughout the years. So as of February of this year, there are approximately 76 individuals in our population. But of course, as we're moving into chick season, we're hoping to grow that size. So this black line here depicts the population size over time. So here we have that. You can see that there was a really large increase as we had all of these releases, but it eventually steadied out over time as we tried to switch to parent-reared birds, and also as we tried to grow the wild population. So you can see in these more recent years, we have a lot more wild fledged birds, which we're very proud of. In the past few years, we have had a bit of a decline, and part of that is because of the pandemic. So if you look here in 2020, there is no light green bar, which represents the released birds. And that's because our staff and a lot of other staff could not safely be on site to raise and release these birds. Another reason for this is because one of our breeding sites in Pentuxet, I believe, closed, and those birds, those breeding whooping cranes, got moved elsewhere, but they are off the market for a period of time, so they will be coming back as breeding birds here soon. So all these green bars represent birds added to the population. Their releases are wild fledged birds. And then all of the orange or red bars represent birds that were removed, either through confirmed mortalities. Some of them are listed as long-term missing. And then you'll see some were removed for the population, either for their safety or because their genetics were valuable, or they just weren't suited to live in the wild. So what's causing these mortalities in the population today? 47% of mortalities are caused by predation. So there's a bobcat here. Another common one is coyotes, raccoons. Occasionally, especially with chicks, it can be larger birds of prey. And then 26% of mortalities are caused by impact trauma. So again, power lines and cars. 17% are caused by gunshots or poaching. And then it's also worth noting that 6 deaths have been attributed to infection. And there's some evidence suggesting that lead poisoning could be a contributing factor in some impact trauma deaths. So when birds get lead poisoning, it often results in some neurological symptoms that might make them fly or behave in a manner that's not safe. Some ongoing threats to whooping cranes today. First and foremost, there is the fact that they are an endangered species. So when a species is endangered, there's so few individuals in the population that any small setback can be really detrimental. So the pandemic, for example. And again, cranes are a very long-lived species. They're only raising 1 chick a year, and that chick takes 3 to 5 years to reach sexual maturity. It takes a really long time for a species like that to bounce back, and it takes a lot of hard work. Next, there's the threat of urban expansion and continued habitat loss. So agricultural fields, again, and then just living space. There's continued challenges to the Clean Water Act, which is an act that protects wetlands. Again, cranes and whooping cranes especially, but all crane species are very wetland dependent, and their future depends a lot on the conservation of our wetlands. There's the threat of impact trauma because of the expansion of voltage lines and wind and solar farms. So again, we work closely with energy companies to try to mitigate these challenges and to try to reach sustainable energy solutions that will not put our populations at risk. There's the continued threat of poaching. And again, this is poaching. This is not mistaken IDs from hunting. There's been no correlation found between honest mistaken hunters. The people who are shooting whooping cranes are poachers and they know what they're doing. And then this is a bit of a looming threat, but there is the debate of the sandhill crane hunting season. So this hunting season is proposed for the fall. If you'll remember back, the juvenile cranes are migrating with the whooping cranes. The juvenile whooping cranes are migrating with the adults in the fall, and they still have that cinnamon coloration. So when they're in large flocks like that, we do worry for the safety of our juveniles. And the International Crane Foundation is against the sandhill crane hunt, but we want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to be prepared for whatever the outcome of that debate might be. So we continue to educate people regardless of the outcome of that debate. So at this point, many people start to ask, what can I do on an individual level to help these whooping cranes? And I don't know, we're a bit short on time. I would typically ask for you all to drop some ideas in the chat, but I'll just go through what I usually tell people. So in your day-to-day life, one of the best things you can do is just educate yourself, your friends, and your family about the importance of these birds. And then alongside of that, knowing how to correctly ID them in the field. And once you know how to correctly ID them in the field, knowing how to treat them with respect. Another thing you can do is knowing how to advocate and protect wetlands. So on an individual level, that means avoiding pollution from fertilizers and pesticides. It also means advocating for protection of the wetlands by talking to legislators and by using your power to vote. But of course, one of the best ways you can be a steward for these cranes and other endangered species is by being a responsible birder. So we're going to go through some safe birding practices, especially when you're on the lookout for whooping cranes. The first thing that we want to make sure of is we're giving whooping cranes at least 200 yards. So that's 2 football fields. Whooping cranes are very sensitive to disturbance. So even if you're on their territory, they're not always necessarily going to come and attack you. Sometimes they'll just move away, but we don't want to do that. That stresses the bird out. We want to make sure that they're feeling safe in their territory, especially during breeding and nesting season. So if you ever go out to Nisita or Horicon and you see a whooping crane, make sure you're giving them that space. Just as a general birding practice, always make sure you're staying on trails and respecting private property. This definitely keeps you safe as the birder, but it also keeps animals safe who use that space. It gives them a chance to get away from any human disturbance. So we don't want to go into their area. If you're lucky enough to see one, that's great, but make sure you're respecting those private properties. Finally, we talked about this a bit, but recognizing whooping crane behavior. So this photo here, this is a very angry whooping crane. You can see its head is up. It's actually showing off that red patch, and its wings are stepped back, or its wings are back. So that means that you need to take a step back. You see these behaviors, make sure to tell people around you and make sure that you yourself are giving these cranes their space. And that goes for any species. Finally, something that you can do to help us monitor these populations is reporting banded whooping cranes to this website right here. But we really like to encourage people, and it's really important to the whooping crane's safety that you're keeping their location private. That means not sharing it on social media, and also not sharing it with other birders. So you can share the county that the bird was found in, but we really don't want to share their exact location because that can introduce unnecessary disturbance by people trying to come and see the crane. And then of course on social media, there's always the threat that that information can fall into the wrong hands. But if you are lucky enough to see a banded whooping crane in this population, Here are the steps you can take to report that sighting to us. First thing you're going to want to do is confirm that you saw a whooping crane, which I'm very confident you can all do after the beginning part of this presentation. Next thing you can do is head to this website here, whoopermap.savingcranes.org. And this highlights where whooping cranes are in the state by county. So if there are whooping cranes in your area and you believe you saw one, it's very likely. But if you're also really confident in your ID, it could be that you're seeing the first one in your area. So you can still go ahead and report that to bandedcranes.org. All of our birds in the eastern migratory population have this band scheme made up of white, green, red, and black bands. And some of them have these radio transmitters like you can see on this bird's leg here. So this bird here, if I were to report this to bandedcranes.org, I would say left leg white, green, red, and then right leg white, and it's a bit difficult to see, but the bottom of this transmitter is actually red. So we ask people to report these sightings, and then from there, we enter it into our database, and we use it to track where these birds are and what they're doing. So as a summary, what can you do to help? You can know how to identify these cranes and look for them carefully on the landscape. You can report them to us. As always, you should be reporting poaching or harassment of cranes to your local authorities. This number right here is for the anonymous DNR tip line, 1-800-TIP-WDNR. You can talk to your friends and legislators about cranes and wetlands in Wisconsin and why you give a whoop about our whooping cranes. And then you can head to our website, savingcranes.org, to learn more about our mission statements or to volunteer with the International Crane Foundation. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you again, and a special thanks to Tim for inviting me to speak with you all, and we will open it up to any questions.